Thanks for stopping by. This is Double Dragon for the NES, developed by Technos and published by TradeWest back in 1988. This is a console version of a popular arcade game from the 80s, and I remember this arcade cabinet when it was released, because it was at a local pizza stop, and there were a couple of kids from school that were telling everybody about it. They were really impressed as to how much fun the game was, and I remember them describing the gameplay, and being kinda confused because I never heard a video game being able to play like this. I think that was the place I played it first. Double Dragon is basically one of the early brawlers. It's the first game I remember to have fighting moves that were more interesting than just a simple punch and a kick. You get to do a bunch of cool things here. The story, it's basic enough. Your girlfriend is kidnapped by a gang, and you're fighting these gang members to try and rescue her. I guess that's a good enough reason to get into a fight. From the get-go, this game is definitely filled with violence. We're talking violence against both men and women alike. Hell, the opening scene is your girlfriend getting punched in the gut and then thrown over some guy's shoulder. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of story. This particular Double Dragon game apparently got a bunch of criticism for some of the problems it had. I don't remember complaining or caring about these sorts of things when I was a kid, but I guess I understand them. The developers apparently ran into some sort of programming limitation based on their experience. So goes the story. First, we're going to get flicker on screen sometimes. In certain instances, it's going to feel like a big deal, and in other times, not so much. Also, there are never more than 2 enemies on screen at one time, and if there are 2, they're the same type of enemy. Later, Double Dragon games didn't seem to have these types of limits. My understanding, it was the experience of the programmers. They weren't sure how to get around these limitations. Also, there is a 2-player game here, but there's no 2-player cooperative play. You just trade off back and forth, which is kind of a bummer. There is a secondary game mode, which is nice. It's basically a one-on-one mode, where you get to choose from a handful of different characters, and then you fight your double. I wouldn't say it's a groundbreaking addition, but it's certainly something interesting that they added in. It's always nice to have something else. The game overall, it's about offense. It's a button masher that's limited by the configuration of the NES controller. The Double Dragon arcade game, it had 3 buttons, and the NES only has 2. Still, it handles okay with this limitation. Here, A punches and B kicks. If you press A and B together, it makes you jump. It would certainly be easier if there was a dedicated jump button, but the configuration works okay. The real interesting thing about this game is that you get to do more moves on the later levels. You actually level up after you defeat enemies, and the additional moves can get pretty good. Level 1 is going to feel really basic because you just have punches and kicks. But eventually, you get to use jump kicks, a backwards elbow smash. You get to throw your enemies. You can sit on someone that you've knocked down, and you can pound them into the ground. I think my favorite is probably when you grab someone's hair and you smash them into your knee to knock them out. I think it's pretty satisfying when you execute it. You get a total of 4 different stages that you work through. There's a city slum, an industrial area, there's a forest, and then there's the end boss's hideout. We get a handful of different enemy types in this one, and along the way, some of them will actually be carrying weapons. I think one of the great things about Double Dragon is if you defeat an enemy that has a weapon, they drop the weapon, and you can pick it up and use it. The weapons are definitely fun to use, for sure, but they do feel a little worse here compared to the arcade version. In the NES version, your weapon disappears after you beat the enemies that dropped it, like if 2 enemies came on screen and one drops a whip. When you defeat those 2, the weapon also disappears, which stinks. So if you get something you like, I don't know, like a whip or something, and early in a stage, it's unfortunate that you won't be carrying it with you to the end of the level. That's really kind of a bummer, because when you get a weapon, it's usually pretty powerful. You get whips, a knife, a bat, a crate, a barrel, a rock, and there's also a stick of dynamite, but I tend to run away from the stick of dynamite because I never seem to be successful with it. All the other weapons I pick up I use as soon as I can, but I try to not use the dynamite. Weapons, they're much safer to use compared to your fists. okay? It's less of a risk to take a swing at somebody with the baseball bat than to try to get up close and punch them. Or at least that's what I find. And I'm always doing whatever I can to conserve health in this game, so anytime a weapon shows up, if I can get somebody from a slightly longer distance, that's what I'm going to gravitate towards. Also, I'm going to use the same attack for certain villains over and over, if it works. When you finally get the jump kick, you can use it pretty successfully in some situations with some enemies. It might not look as pretty just using the same move over and over again in certain places, but man, it will keep you alive. I wouldn't call this version of Double Dragon a particularly deep game, but it's a decent variety when you have your offense leveled up anyway, and you get to pick up and use these weapons, which is nice, even if they're only temporary. It would have been nice to have more than 2 enemies on the screen at the same time, but it's not something I consider a deal breaker for this particular NES game. Also, it would be better with cooperative play, right, but I think we get all those sort of functions in the later games in the series. Well, that's all I have today for Double Dragon for the NES. It's a brawler that's kind of fun to dedicate a little bit of time to. I don't know if I would dedicate days upon days playing it, but punching for a while is pretty enjoyable. If this is your type of video, please feel free to like and subscribe to the channel, and hope to catch you on another video.